The wind came down from the high ridges like a living thing, thin, sharp, and whistling through sage and dry grass. It was the kind of wind that found every crack in a man's coat, that lifted the edge of roof shingles and set the barn door groaning. Evening had fallen early, pressing the land beneath a sky the color of iron. Along the narrow road, a single rider moved slowly through the dusk. Her horse was lean and dark, breath showing white in the cold. The woman's shawl, once red, had faded to the color of old clay. Frost gathered along her braids. She rode like someone who had come far and long ago stopped counting the miles. Below her, the valley waited, quiet, tired, a patchwork of yellowed grass and broken fences. The house at its center looked half asleep, boards gray with age, one lantern burning dim in the window. That was the Hale ranch, though few called it by name anymore. Jonas Hale lived alone now. Folks said he'd been that way since the fever took his wife 7 winters back. He didn't come to town unless he had to. Didn't talk much when he did. The kind of man who kept his grief folded tight and his whiskey rationed. The woman reached the yard and dismounted, boots sinking in cold mud. She tied her horse to the rail and stood for a long while, staring at the house as though trying to remember something about it. A shape in a dream, a voice half heard. Then she climbed the steps and knocked. The sound startled the quiet. Inside, Jonas looked up from the hearth where a low fire burned. For a moment he thought the knock was only the wind again, but it came twice more, soft, certain. He set down the tin cup in his hand and crossed the room. When he opened the door, snowflakes followed the woman in, glittering in her hair. He frowned. "You lost?" She studied his face, the gray in his beard, the scar near his eye, the tired kindness that still lingered there. "No," she said quietly. "I've come to find you." He looked past her, expecting perhaps a wagon, a husband, a brother. The yard was empty. Only her horse stood waiting in the mist. "I don't reckon I know you, ma'am," he said. Her gaze didn't waver. "You did once, long ago. My name is Nayeli." The name struck him like a small bell rung in the dark. He blinked. For an instant, the firelight behind him flickered across a memory. A burned camp, smoke curling through mesquite, the weight of a child in his arms. A girl, her wrists like twigs, her eyes wide with hunger and terror. He had thought of her only a handful of times in 20 years. Always fleetingly, always with a sense of unease. "You," he began, then stopped. "That can't be." "It is," she said. "You found me by the river. You carried me out. You left me with a priest who took me east." Jonas stepped back, stunned by how calmly she spoke of it, how the years had turned her voice into something even and sure. "That was a lifetime ago," she nodded once. "It was mine." The silence stretched, filled only by the hiss of the fire. Finally, she said the words that would not leave him for the rest of his days. "You once saved my life. I've come to marry you." For a long time he said nothing. His first thought was that she must be mad. The second was that perhaps he was, standing there letting the cold creep into his bones while a stranger spoke like prophecy. "You don't know what you're saying," he managed. "I do. I'm not the man you remember. Whatever kindness I gave you, it was a long while back. You don't owe me anything." Her eyes didn't lower. "It isn't debt," she said softly. "It's home." He turned away, rubbing a hand over his jaw, searching for words that wouldn't sound cruel. "You can stay the night," he said finally. "Storm's coming in, but come morning, I'll see you to town. The mission there's got room for travelers." She didn't argue, only nodded as though she'd expected it. When she unpinned her shawl, he saw the faint line of a scar along her collarbone, pale against her skin. Old, healed, but deep. He remembered another wound like it, a long time ago. He cleared his throat. "There's stew left if you want some." "I would be grateful." While she ate at the small wooden table, he sat across from her, pretending to read the ledger he hadn't touched in months. The lamplight softened the lines on her face. She was not young, nor old, somewhere in that quiet middle ground where a woman carried the weight of her own years with grace. Outside, wind swept across the porch, rattling the eaves. "Why now?" he asked at last. "After 20 years?" She set the spoon down carefully. "Because I had to be sure I could come with something to give. For a long time I had nothing but my breath. Now I have strength, and peace, and a horse that listens when I sing. I thought maybe that was enough to bring back to the man who saved me. Jonas felt something shift inside him, small and dangerous. "You don't know me," he said again, though the words had no weight now. "I know what kind of man rides into fire for a stranger," she said. He looked at her then, really looked, at the steadiness of her gaze, the quiet in her posture, the way she didn't flinch from the cold or from him. Outside, snow began to fall harder, whispering against the window glass. He stood, reached for another log, and placed it on the fire. "There's a cot in the other room," he said gruffly. "You can take it. I'll be in here." She rose and thanked him in a tone that carried no submission, only simple gratitude. Before she disappeared down the short hallway, she paused. "You haven't changed as much as you think," she said. "You still open your door to the wind." When she was gone, Jonas sat for a long time staring at the flames. He thought of his wife, of the years between, of the way grief had turned his life into a narrow path of work and silence. And now, without warning, that silence had been cracked open by a woman carrying his own forgotten kindness back to him like an ember she had kept alive. He didn't know what to make of it, only that the house felt less hollow for the first time in years. Outside, the wind howled down from the ridges again, but it sounded different now. Less like mourning, more like a song returning from far away. Emotional tone and realization, cold, wary, filled with unspoken history and restrained humanity. The scene closes with both characters changed, Jonas reminded of the man he once was, and Nayeli standing as the embodiment of memory that refuses to die. The first thaw has begun. The next morning came gray and sharp, the kind of dawn that tasted of frost and iron. The world outside Jonas's window was silent, but for the creak of a windmill and the distant cry of crows. He lay awake long before sunrise, listening to the faint sounds from the kitchen. A pan being lifted, the slow pour of water, the muted scrape of a spoon. When he finally stepped out of his room, Nayeli was already there, sleeves rolled, hair tied back, coaxing life from the old stove that hadn't burned steady in years. The air smelled of coffee and smoke and something unfamiliar, juniper perhaps, or desert herbs. She looked up, nodded once in quiet greeting and went back to her work. He didn't thank her. Not yet. He didn't know how to. Through the short days that followed, she moved about the ranch as though she'd always belonged to the rhythm of it. She mended harness straps with a patience he'd never seen, cleaned tools dulled by disuse, and patched the holes in the roof where years of wind had worn through. She rose before him, worked beside him, spoke little. Jonas watched her in fragments, the curve of her hand on a fence post, the way she whispered to the horse before setting the saddle, the quiet dignity that clung to her like light. He found himself waiting for the sound of her footsteps, for the smell of coffee in the early hours, though he never admitted as much. By the end of the week, word had reached town, an Apache woman at Hale's ranch, staying under his roof. The talk spread like dust in the wind, impossible to hold back once it began. In the general store, men made crude jokes beneath their breath. On the boardwalk, women pulled their shawls tighter and looked away. Children stared, curious and bold in their innocence. Nayeli walked through it all with her head unbowed, expression unreadable, hands clasped before her. Jonas saw it when he rode in for supplies, saw how she bore the stairs like one might bear a winter storm, not fighting it, only waiting for it to pass. He wanted to speak, to tell them to mind their business. But he'd long since learned that the West had sharp edges for those who spoke too loudly on behalf of others. That night, after they'd returned, he found her sitting outside beneath the darkening sky, mending a torn glove by the faint light of the moon. He stood in the doorway, unsure whether to interrupt. "They look at you like you don't belong," he said finally. Nayeli didn't raise her head. "I am used to that. You shouldn't have to be." She gave a small, tired smile. "That's what everyone says until they see it happen." Jonas said nothing more. The silence between them was not cold, only deep. He went back inside, but the words lingered with him through the night. Sleep came in fragments. In the dark, old memories stirred. The crack of gunfire, the red glow of a burning village, the smell of smoke and blood. He saw himself again, 20 years younger, riding down into a canyon where the river turned black with ash. He saw the girl, thin, trembling, clutching a broken doll made of sticks. When he reached her, she'd tried to bite him, not out of anger, but terror. He had lifted her anyway, wrapped her in his coat, and carried her out through the ruin. He woke before dawn, heart pounding. The memory felt sharper now, as though time had stopped sanding it down. When he entered the kitchen that morning, Nayeli was already there. She noticed his pallor, the sweat along his brow. "You dreamed of it," she said, not asking but knowing. Jonas nodded once. "How could I not?" She poured him coffee without a word and set it in front of him. For a long while neither spoke. Then quietly she said, "I remember that night too. The sky was red. My mother's hair smelled like cedar. I thought I was dying." He swallowed hard. "I didn't know what else to do. I thought leaving you with the mission was the only chance you had." Nayeli stared into the steam rising from her cup. "It was a chance. I lived." There was no anger in her tone, only a kind of tired truth. She went on, her voice low, measured, almost prayerful. "At the mission they cut my hair. Said the braids were heathen. They gave me another name, one I could not speak without shame. I scrubbed floors, washed linens, learned to say grace in a tongue that did not fit my mouth. I forgot how to pray in my own." Jonas looked down at his hands, rough, scarred, the same hands that had once carried her. "They hurt you." "They made me civilized," she said, with a bitterness so faint it almost wasn't there. "That is what they called it." He opened his mouth to apologize, but no words came. Nayeli rose, moving to the window where the dawn light gathered like thin gold dust. "I worked at the mission until I was grown. When the priest died, I left. I rode south, found work in ranches and trading posts. I learned your language better than my own. Every place I went, someone would ask where I came from. I would tell them I came from nowhere." Jonas stood slowly. "You said I saved you," he murmured. She turned to him, eyes dark and steady. "You did. You saved me from death, but you left me with no place to belong." "I do not say that in anger, only truth." He felt the words settle in him like stones dropped into still water, heavy, rippling, impossible to take back. "I thought I was doing right," he said. "I know." Her voice softened. So did they. They stood there for a moment, two figures shaped by choices neither could undo. Outside, the morning light spread over the valley, thin but persistent. "Finally," she added, "I came back because I needed to see the man who chose to save a child and then forget her. I needed to see if that man still lived." Jonas met her gaze. "And what do you see?" She studied him, the gray in his beard, the sorrow that never left his eyes. "I see a man still trying to make peace with ghosts." He exhaled slowly. "And we have that in common." The clock ticked in the silence that followed. Somewhere outside, the windmill turned with a slow creak. Nayeli gathered her shawl and stepped toward the door. "The fence by the south pasture needs mending," she said. "I will start there." Jonas watched her go, watched the sun catch the loose end of her braid as she walked into the light. He stood for a long time after, feeling the strange ache of understanding settling deep in his chest. Not guilt alone, but something like awakening. He realized that saving her had not ended that night by the river. It had only been the beginning, a beginning he'd buried beneath years of solitude, now unearthed by her quiet presence. When he finally stepped outside, the day had warmed just enough to melt the frost on the rails. The world smelled faintly of thawing earth. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried over the canyon, a long, lonely sound that seemed to stretch between them, between past and present, loss in the faint hope of belonging. Emotional tone and realization, regret and awakening. Both characters confront the hidden cost of survival. Her exile from identity, his from meaning. The tone is soft, sorrowful, and intimate, a candle of memory burning steady against the cold. By late afternoon, the sky had turned the color of pewter. A low wind slid through the valley, stirring dust and dry leaves. Jonas stood on the porch, reading the signs like a man who'd known storms his whole life. The horizon had gone black where it met the ridges. Not dusk, but thunderclouds building, layered and thick, rolling like an army across the land. He called to Nayeli, who was hanging damp clothes on the line. "Bring those in," he said. "We'll have rain before supper." She nodded, calm as always. "It smells like it," she replied. The air did smell of rain, sharp, electric, the way it does when the world holds its breath before breaking. By the time they got the animals under shelter, the wind had turned wild. It roared through the cottonwoods and sent the barn door slamming against its frame. Jonas cursed softly, running from stall to stall to make sure the horses were tied secure. Nayeli followed without hesitation, gathering loose feed, closing the chicken coop, her braid whipping against her back like a black ribbon. The first drop hit his cheek, cold as melted ice. Then came another, then hundreds. Within moments the rain was pouring hard, a solid wall of water beating against the roofs, hissing in the troughs, turning the yard into a sea of mud. Thunder rolled close, loud enough to shake the windows of the house. "Get inside," Jonas shouted, but Nayeli was already moving toward the open gate, where two young calves bawled, frightened and half-mired in the muck. She slipped past him, wading through the rain, her skirt heavy with mud. "Leave them," he called, but she didn't. By the time he reached her, she had one calf by the halter, pulling hard to drag it back to the barn. He grabbed the other, and together they shoved and cursed and coaxed the terrified animals into safety. When they finally slammed the barn door shut, both were soaked through. Hair plastered to their faces, breath coming in clouds. Nayeli laughed, a short, breathless sound of exhaustion and disbelief. Jonas looked at her and, for the first time in years, felt the rough edge of a smile pull at his own mouth. "Stubborn woman," he muttered. She brushed water from her eyes. "You would have done the same." Outside, thunder cracked like rifle fire. They reached the house just as the storm reached its height. The rain came sideways now, rattling the shutters and pounding the roof so hard it seemed the whole sky had split open. Inside, the lantern flickered in the wind's breath that crept through unseen gaps. Jonas poured them both coffee, though his hands trembled with cold. Then came a sound above the storm, the sharp, distant strike of hooves against the wet ground. A rider. Jonas set down his cup, the warmth leaving his fingers at once. "No one's fool enough to be riding in this," he said. The hooves drew closer, stopping just beyond the porch. A moment later, there was a heavy knock at the door. Jonas opened it to find Cal Dalton, drenched to the bone, rain dripping from his hat brim. Dalton was younger by a few years, but harder in the face, eyes sharp with the kind of meanness that grows from debt and drink. "Hell of a night," Dalton said, stepping in without invitation. "Figured I'd ride out the storm here. You've got room." Jonas stared at him, then at the puddle spreading beneath his boots. "You can come in," he said flatly, "but wipe your damn feet." Dalton grinned. Always hospitable, Hale. He tossed his hat on the table, helped himself to a seat near the fire, and reached for the whiskey bottle on the shelf. Jonas didn't stop him. He'd learned long ago that confronting Cal Dalton while liquor was close at hand only led to trouble. Nayeli entered quietly from the kitchen, drying her hair with a towel. Dalton's gaze snapped to her like a hawk-spotting movement. "Well, I'll be," he drawled. "Didn't know you had company, Jonas. Pretty thing, ain't she?" Jonas's jaw tightened. "This is Miss Nayeli. She's helping around the place," Dalton smirked. "Helping, huh? I'd say she's got the look of someone who don't belong in a place like this." Nayeli didn't answer. She only crossed to the hearth, added a log to the fire, and knelt to warm her hands. Her composure only seemed to amuse Dalton more. He poured another drink, his voice turning lazy, slurred by whiskey. "You know, my old man used to say a house ain't proper unless there's a woman in it." "Never said what kind." Jonas stepped forward. "That's enough." Dalton raised both hands in mock surrender. "Easy, Hale. Just making talk." When he rose to leave the fire, he brushed past Nayeli, and his hand lingered too long on her arm. Not rough, not open-handed, just a deliberate touch that said more than words. Before Nayeli could move, Jonas was between them. His voice was low, dangerous. "Take your hand off her." Dalton stared at him, a slow grin spreading. "Or what?" Jonas didn't answer. He just held his gaze until Dalton saw something there that made his grin fade. The storm outside raged, thunder splitting the silence like a verdict. At last, Dalton stepped back, muttering, "Didn't mean no harm." He grabbed his hat and turned for the door. "Reckon the storm's letting up anyway. Wouldn't want to overstay my welcome." Jonas said nothing as Dalton disappeared into the downpour, the sound of his horse fading into the distance. Afterward, the silence in the house felt enormous. Only the rain spoke, softening now, its anger spent. Nayeli turned to Jonas. "You shouldn't have risked angering him," she said quietly. "Men like that don't forget." "Neither do I," he replied. She crossed to him then, took his hand. A thin line of blood ran across his knuckles, from where he'd struck the doorframe earlier perhaps, or when he'd clenched his fist. She fetched a cloth, dipped it in water, and cleaned the cut with care. "You don't owe me protection," she murmured. Jonas looked down at her hands. Steady. Sure, their warmth seeping through the cold in his skin. "Maybe I do," he said softly. "Maybe I always did." She didn't answer, only wrapped the cloth tight, her fingers brushing his wrist. The firelight flickered between them, painting the room in shades of gold and shadow. Then she began to hum, low, rhythmic, the sound ancient and soft. The melody filled the room like smoke, slow and wordless, a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. Jonas listened, feeling something uncoil inside him, not peace exactly, but something close to it. Outside, the storm began to fade. The last roll of thunder drifted across the valley. Rain softened to a whisper, then to silence. When dawn came, the sky was clear and bright, the world scrubbed clean. Steam rose from the wet earth, and somewhere far off, a lark began to sing. Jonas stood by the doorway, watching the light spill across the yard. Behind him, Nayeli moved quietly, humming still. For the first time in many years, he felt the house breathe again, emotional tone and realization, protective, intimate, dangerous. The storm mirrors the turmoil between them and the outside world. Jonas's silent decency meets Nayeli's unwavering strength, and in that brief, quiet night, trust is born from danger. The storm passed, but its shadow lingered. Days came quiet and slow, with the land washed clean and the air sharp with the scent of wet cedar. The fences needed mending, the pastures needed clearing, and the long silence between Jonas and Nayeli needed no tending at all. It seemed to grow on its own, soft and steady, like grass after rain. Each morning, Nayeli rose before the sun. Jonas would find her already at work, sweeping the porch, setting dough to rise, feeding the chickens that used to scatter at the sight of him. The house, once hollow with dust and disuse, began to breathe again. The curtains fluttered against open windows, light spilled across the floorboards, and the smell of fresh bread reached every room like a quiet miracle. Jonas didn't say much. He never had, but he caught himself waiting for the sound of her humming. That low, patient tune that drifted from the kitchen or the barn, something older than language, older even than his regrets. In town, however, tongues began to wag. Red Willow was small, and storms had a way of stirring up more than weather. Jonas went in one morning for supplies, flour, salt, a new coil of rope. The clerk's wife, Mrs. Pike, paused mid-measure when she saw him. "Heard you've got company out there," she said, too lightly to be kind. "Some say she's one of those from the reservation." Jonas met her gaze. "She's a hand," he said simply. "Helps with chores." "Still," she said, lowering her voice. "People talk. It's not proper, a woman like that living under a man's roof." He paid and left without another word. But her tone followed him all the way home, like burrs stuck to his coat. That evening, a rider came down the lane. The preacher, Reverend Cole, black coat flapping like a crow's wings. Jonas saw him from the porch and didn't bother to hide his sigh. "Afternoon, Reverend." "Jonas," the preacher said, removing his hat. "Mind if I come in a moment?" Jonas gestured toward the porch bench instead. "Reckon you can say what you came to say right there." Cole nodded, set his hat on his knee. "It's not my business what a man does in his own home," he began, which Jonas knew meant the opposite. "But there's concern. Folks are saying you've taken in one of them Indian women. You know how people are. It's bad for your name." Jonas looked out across his land, the fields gold under the setting sun, the hills still green from the storm. "My name don't buy me feed, Reverend." "My work does," Cole's mouth tightened. "You can't save them all, Jonas. Some things best left in God's hands." Jonas's voice stayed calm. Maybe he put this one in mind. They held each other's eyes a long moment. Then Cole rose, dusting off his coat. "You've always been a stubborn man." "Helps me sleep," Jonas said, and didn't offer him coffee. That night, the house was quiet. Nayeli sat by the fire, stitching a torn sleeve from one of Jonas's shirts. He came in with his boots still muddy, paused at the doorway as if afraid to bring the outside in. "There's talk in town," he said finally. "There always is," she replied without looking up. He nodded, standing near the fire. "The preacher came by. Said folks don't like seeing you here." Her needle paused mid-stitch. "Do you?" He hesitated. "I like seeing you here more than I thought I would." She met his eyes then, something unreadable moving behind hers. Not gratitude, not surprise, but recognition. A quiet understanding that neither of them had asked for this, and yet here they were. A few days later, Nayeli was sweeping the loft of the barn when her broom struck something hollow beneath the dust. She knelt, brushed the dirt aside, and found an old cedar trunk with brass corners dulled to green. The latch was stiff, but not locked. Inside lay a folded dress, pale blue once, though time had yellowed it to ivory. The fabric was soft as old paper, the hem frayed, the bodice hand-stitched with tiny flowers. Beneath it, a ribbon and a small framed photograph, Jonas and a woman with kind eyes, her smile faint, like she hadn't quite learned how to hold happiness. Nayeli closed the trunk gently, carried the folded dress to the house, and laid it across the arm of Jonas's chair. She said nothing. When he came in that evening and saw it there, he stopped short. For a long time he didn't move. His hand hovered over the fabric, fingers trembling slightly. "She was kind," he said at last. His voice came rough as though unused. "Didn't take to the land easy, though. Got sick the second winter. Said she'd never seen a place so lonely." Nayeli's voice was soft. "So was I." He looked up then, at her standing in the lamplight, quiet but unafraid. Something in her words cracked the shell of his silence. "Guess we both been carrying ghosts," he said. She folded the dress neatly again. "Then let's not carry them alone." In the evenings they worked side by side. He showed her how to read the ranch ledger, explaining columns and figures, his finger tracing the rows of faded ink. She learned quickly, careful and precise. In turn, she taught him how to braid horsehair, thin strands looped and twisted into a small ring for luck. Their hands brushed once, then again. Neither pulled away. When night came, they sat before the fire, the same fire that had burned cold for years before she arrived. Outside, the coyotes sang across the hills, and the house seemed to hum with its own kind of life. Jonas glanced at her, the firelight reflected in her eyes. "You think the storm's really gone?" he asked. Nayeli smiled faintly. "Storms don't go. They just learn where to rest." That night, Jonas dreamed of his wife, her voice soft as rain, her eyes not sad this time but watching, almost approving. When he woke, the house was still and warm. Nayeli's braid hung from the peg by the door, a circle woven from hair and patience. He touched it lightly, and for the first time in a long while, the weight of the years seemed to lift. Outside, the sun rose over Red Willow, gilding the world in a new kind of light. Emotional tone and realization, subtle intimacy, restrained yearning, and shared solitude. Jonas and Nayeli begin to belong again, not as savior and saved, but as equals, rebuilding from the quiet wreckage of their pasts. Each gesture, each word, stitches a little more of their world back together. Evening fell heavy and low, the kind of dusk that seemed to hold its breath. The air carried a strange stillness, too quiet, too expectant. Jonas had been out by the barn, checking the fencing after the last windstorm, while Nayeli gathered the day's wash from the line. She paused at the sound of hoofbeats. 3 horses, rough riders. The rhythm was wrong, urgent, uneven, drunk. Jonas straightened from his work. "Get inside," he murmured. The riders came out of the dim, Cal Dalton at their head, hat tipped low, whiskey in his grin. Behind him rode 2 others from town, men without much to lose. Dalton dismounted with a stagger, boots crunching the brittle earth. "Evenin', Hale," he called. "Heard you've been keeping company with a lady that don't belong here." Jonas didn't answer. He stood in the barn doorway, shoulders squared, the pitchfork still in his hand. Nayeli stood just beyond the porch, shawl drawn tight, her face unreadable. Dalton's eyes fixed on her. Pretty thing for one of 'em. "Must have bewitched you, old man. Folks talk, say she's been stealing. Maybe casting spells on your cattle." Jonas's voice came low and even. "You're drunk, Cal. Go home before you say something you can't take back." Dalton laughed, stumbling closer. "Can't take back? I'm just telling truth. She's a snake hiding in your house."
"You gonna wait till she bites you?"
He reached for Nayeli's shawl. Jonas moved faster. The pitchfork clattered to the ground as his fist caught Dalton square in the jaw. The man reeled, fell hard, then came up spitting blood and fury. The other 2 dismounted, shouting. One swung a lantern, the flame swaying wild. "Jonas!" Nayeli's voice cut through the dark, clear, commanding. Dalton lunged, grappling with Jonas in the dirt. The lantern smashed against the wall. Oil splashed. Fire bloomed like a living thing. The dry hay caught first. Then the stall. In seconds, orange light roared up the timbers. Horses shrieked, eyes rolling white. Jonas broke free, grabbing Dalton by the collar and throwing him aside. "Get the animals!" he shouted. Nayeli ran into the smoke without hesitation, untying ropes, slapping reins, leading 2 terrified mares toward the open gate. Sparks whipped her shawl, burned through the edge of her braid. The other men turned to run. One tripped, cursing. The other grabbed his fallen rifle, wild-eyed and afraid. Nayeli snatched Jonas's own rifle from the rack by the door, cocked it with steady hands, and fired a single shot into the air. The sound split the chaos, and sharp, absolute, "Go!" she cried in English that carried the cadence of her people. The men fled, stumbling into the night, their curses swallowed by wind. One clutched his shoulder, blood darkening his sleeve. Jonas turned, coughing, his face streaked with soot. The roof of the barn groaned, the fire climbing higher. "Leave it!" he yelled, but Nayeli was still inside. He ran in after her, heat blistering his skin. She was pulling the last of the harnesses from a frightened colt, whispering to it in Apache, her voice calm amid the storm of flame. Together they led the animal out, stumbling into the open air, just as the rafters collapsed behind them. The world turned gold and red. The sky filled with ash. They dropped to their knees in the dirt, gasping, faces lit by the ruin of the barn. Hours passed in fragments, buckets of water, wet blankets, the hiss of dying fire. By the time the flames sank to embers, dawn was bleeding over the ridge. The barn stood half gone, its frame black and skeletal. Smoke drifted slow and steady into the pale morning. Jonas leaned against the fence post, shoulders shaking from exhaustion. His shirt was scorched, one sleeve torn. Nayeli knelt beside a trough, washing soot from her hands. The water turned black, then gray, then clear again. He looked at her, the streaks of ash across her face, the raw skin at her wrists, the way she breathed as if each breath was proof of survival. "You've more courage than any man I've known," he said hoarsely. She glanced at him, a faint smile ghosting her lips. "You gave it to me once," she answered. They didn't move toward each other. They didn't have to. The space between them was already alive with what words couldn't hold. As the sun climbed, the damage came into full view. The barn's west wall had collapsed entirely, the roof gone, the air thick with the bitter scent of smoke and soaked hay. But the horses were safe, and the house still stood. Jonas walked the perimeter in silence. Nayeli followed, helping where she could, gathering scattered tools, stacking what wood remained. Each motion felt like prayer, deliberate, humble, necessary. When they finally stopped, she took his burned hand in hers, turning it palm up. His skin was blistered, the lines of labor deepened by flame. She tore a strip from her shawl, dipped it in the water bucket, and wrapped his hand gently. He watched her work, his breath slow. "You didn't have to stay," he said quietly. "Could have run. Could have left me to burn." Nayeli's eyes lifted to his. "I ran once," she said. "It took me 20 years to find my way back." The wind stirred between them, carrying the faint scent of cedar smoke and wet earth. Jonas wanted to speak, to say the words that trembled in his chest, but he found none that felt true enough. So he did the only thing that seemed right. He placed his hand, the bandaged one, over hers. They stood that way a long time amid the ashes, watching the smoke curl upward into the light. No kiss, no confession. Just the quiet weight of understanding. Two souls burned clean by the same fire. When the sun broke fully over the valley, it lit the ruins in gold. A hawk circled high, silent against the brightening sky. Nayeli turned toward the house, her steps slow but certain. Jonas followed. Behind them the smoke thinned, rising straight into the windless morning. A thin gray ribbon, winding heavenward like prayer. Emotional tone and realization, fierce, sacrificial and redemptive. The fire becomes their trial, a cleansing that burns away fear, shame, and doubt. In fighting side by side, Jonas and Nayeli stand as equals at last. Their connection, unspoken but absolute, becomes the quiet proof that love, like courage, is born from what survives the flames. Winter broke slow that year, reluctant to let go. Frost still gathered on the eaves each morning, and the creek ran dark with meltwater. Weeks had passed since the fire, but the smell of smoke clung faintly to the air, a ghost neither wind nor rain could quite erase. The barn stood half rebuilt. Jonas worked the hammer while Nayeli steadied the beams, her shawl pinned tight against the chill. The rhythm of their labor was quiet and sure, the steady thud of nails, the murmur of breath, the whisper of wood giving shape again. In town, talk had shifted from scandal to sympathy. Some called the fire an accident. Others said Dalton had it coming, that maybe the land had judged him before the law could. The sheriff came only when the snowmelt made the roads passable. 3 riders in dust-gray coats. Horses leaned from the long trail. They found Jonas mending a gate. "Jonas Hale," the sheriff called, swinging down from his horse. "We've got questions." Jonas set his tools aside, wiping his hands on his trousers. "Reckon you do." The sheriff nodded toward the river valley. Dalton's body turned up downstream. One of his men, too, shot clean through the shoulder. "Said you and the woman were there that night." Jonas didn't answer right away. The wind rustled through the half-built rafters behind him. Nayeli stood in the doorway of the barn, still as stone. "I was here," Jonas said finally. "They came drunk. Tried to start trouble. The fire took care of the rest." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "And the shot?" Jonas glanced toward Nayeli, then back. "Warning only. Didn't aim to kill. They ran. Guess the river did the rest." The lawmen exchanged looks. They had heard things, whispers from town about who'd caused what, about who deserved what came. But in Red Willow, people remembered decency when it mattered most. Mrs. Pike, the gossiping clerk's wife, had told the sheriff, "That Apache girl saved his life, you know." Reverend Cole, for all his sermons, said simply, "Jonas Hale's an honest man. Leave it be." The sheriff studied Jonas a moment longer, then nodded. "Seems to me justice already found its way." "Keep your nose clean, Hale." Jonas dipped his head. "Always have." When the riders left, the sound of their hoofbeats faded into the hills. The ranch fell silent again, the kind of silence that feels earned. Days lengthened. The snow retreated to the high peaks, and shoots of green broke through the ash near the barn. Nayeli worked with a calm grace, planting seeds in the blackened soil where nothing had grown in years. Jonas mended fences, repaired hinges, taught her how to brand calves without cruelty. One evening, he came in from the fields to find her sitting on the porch, the ledger open in her lap. The setting sun turned her braid to copper. "I fixed the numbers," she said, smiling faintly. "You forgot to count 3 head," Jonas chuckled. "Reckon I did." It was a small thing, but it filled the air between them with something new. Not duty, Not gratitude, but belonging. Spring came in earnest. The creek swelled with clear water. Wildflowers crept across the ridge. The land that had burned now shimmered with tender grass, as if the fire had been less a punishment and more a promise. On one mild morning, with the sky soft and open, Nayeli saddled her horse. Jonas watched from the porch, his heart tightening without reason. She adjusted the reins, checked the girth strap, then turned to him. "I'll go if you wish it," she said quietly. "I came because I owed you my life. I stay because I found my own." Jonas looked at her for a long time. The calm in her eyes, the strength in her shoulders, the gentleness that had outlasted all the cruelty the world had offered her. He stepped down from the porch, the boards creaking under his boots. "Then stay," he said simply. Her breath caught, though she did not smile. Instead, she reached out and brushed a fleck of sawdust from his shirt, a small, wordless gesture that said more than any vow could. Later that afternoon, they rode together to the ridge above the ranch. The trail wound through sagebrush and wind-polished stone, the horses' hooves soft on the new grass. From the crest, the whole valley spread out before them. The rebuilt barn, the slow-turning river, the faint wisp of smoke rising from the chimney of a house that finally felt lived in again. They dismounted, standing side by side. The wind tugged at Nayeli's shawl, carrying the scent of pine and wet earth. Jonas took off his hat, holding it in both hands. "Never thought I'd see this land green again," he said. "It was only sleeping," she answered. "Like us." He turned to her, his face lined but peaceful. "You ever think about leaving? Going back south?" Nayeli looked toward the horizon, where the red rocks met the sky. "I thought I would," she said. "But there's nothing left there. The world took it piece by piece. Here." She touched the small braid of horsehair that hung from her saddle, the one they'd made together. "Here, I made something new," Jonas nodded. "Reckon we both did." For a long moment, neither spoke. The sun hung low, casting the valley in gold. Far below, the horses grazed, their shadows long against the earth. Nayeli turned to him. "When you saved me," she said softly, "you gave me a life I didn't understand." "I've been learning it ever since," Jonas met her gaze. "And you saved me back, though I didn't ask for it." They stood together, not touching, but close enough to feel the same wind. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was full, alive, complete. As the day faded, they mounted their horses and began the slow ride home. The trail wound downward, the air rich with the smell of grass and rain. Behind them, the ridge glowed in the last light, the same place where, years before, a man had found a lost child among ashes. Now it was two riders, moving side by side through a valley reborn. When they reached the gate, Jonas dismounted first, opening it for her. She looked at him, the faintest curve at the corner of her mouth. "You keep doing that?" she said. "What's that?" "Making room," Jonas smiled. "Only seems right." They rode on through the fading light, the house waiting ahead. The smoke from its chimney curling upward, thin, steady, unbroken emotional tone and realization. Peaceful, redemptive, complete. The story closes not with grand declarations, but with quiet unity. Two souls who have carried their loneliness as far as it could go, now resting in a place they've built together. Healing, like the land, comes slowly, but it comes.